So I'm going to talk a little bit about what neurons are for and share some recent thinking of myself and some colleagues. And you're all familiar with one version of what neurons are for, which is on the first slide here, which is the old brain in the vat idea from cognitive science, but it actually goes back much farther than that. And Don Hoffman mentioned this idea this morning is that what neurons do is generate the mind. And lots of people at this meeting, of course, will tell you what's wrong with this idea. Don, again, mentioned that this morning. I'm not going to talk about what's wrong with this idea, the idea that leads to the hard problem of consciousness. But I will say that this idea has been dead now for about 30 years. And it's still twitching, of course. There's still people who are going to defend it, but the nails are basically in the coffin. And if you go read the cognitive science literature these days, you're not going to find much of this. What you're going to find instead is a picture that looks like this. Cognitive science has finally, in a sense, woken up to the idea that the brain doesn't do anything without a body, and that, in fact, what the body is doing is implementing a lot of the information processing that the brain does. And the brain doesn't do anything unless it's embedded in an environment that's interesting. And it doesn't do anything at all unless it can act in that environment. And in fact, by acting on that environment, it puts information out into the environment that it then uses. So actually, our minds extend way out into the environment and use all sorts of artifacts, but also natural systems that we've interacted with to store information. And finally, the brain doesn't do anything without emotion. And this was really brought to the fore by Damasio back in the late 80s. But it's taken over cognitive science in a way that has been waiting for a long time. And now you'll even find journals like the IEEE's Journal of Affective Computing. Now, you wouldn't have imagined that electrical engineers were thinking about affective computing. But they've had a whole journal about it for 10 years now. So the times are really changing. And what I want to do is talk about a new idea that's situated within this kind of conceptual space, which is that neurons don't just give the body an ability to function, to behave, to do things in the environment, to act, to think, but neurons also give the body its form. So let's think about this. This question came because my colleague Mike Levin and I were very interested in the question, the kind of deep evolutionary question, of how do you get from a world that's completely inhabited by microorganisms, such as these, algae or bacterial mats or paramecia, creatures like this. How do we get from a world where everybody's a single cell to a world like this that has animals and plants and big organisms like we're familiar with? And to put this question in context, I want to show you a picture of biological diversity. And I've shown this picture here before, but I think it's an important picture to think about. And I'll just highlight one of these that's easier. This is a picture of biological diversity that's constructed by looking at genome diversity. So by measuring the differences between DNA molecules from different organisms. And almost everything you see, all of this and most of this are bacteria and archaea, single-celled organisms that don't even have nuclei. And the single-celled organisms that are like us, that do have nuclei, are all down in here. And you'll see there's a little bitty branch here that's plants and algae, and a little bitty branch over here that's animals and fungi. We are much more closely related to fungi than to plants. And there's almost no diversity in those branches at all. We are far more similar to fungi than most bacteria are to each other. And whereas, it's true, and whereas we're constrained by our bodies to have sex just with each other, all of these, sorry, why are you screwing up with this? All of these organisms can exchange DNA with virtually anybody. So this is evolution's powerhouse. This is where evolution explores different ways to live. This is where evolution explores different ways to manufacture food, different ways to deal with environmental chemistry, different ways to do anything. So you have organisms in there that live in deep sea vents that would boil us instantly. You have organisms in there that can survive many, many, many times what would be a lethal dose of radiation for us. Organisms in there that you can shoot off into space and they'll be perfectly happy for years. So this is where evolution's really doing the work. So that really raises the question of why creatures like us exist at all. What are bodies for if single cells are doing just fine? And in fact, single cells organisms are immortal. And you can kill them if you really try hard. But if you don't actively kill them, they live forever. They just divide and divide and divide, and they're fine. So there are E. coli around now that are 1 billion years old by any reasonable way of looking at it. So this really raises this question: why do we have bodies? Why are there multicellular organisms? And this is the question that Mike and I set out to answer. And just this year, we published our first idea about why this would be. And the basic idea is that bodies were created to minimize uncertainty. Single-celled organisms actually made bodies to be environments that made their lives more predictable, easier to manage. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how that idea works. First, life absolutely requires a certain degree of predictability. If you have too much, then it's boring. But if you don't have enough, you're dead. So, for example, you really need to be able to predict what the local salt concentration is in your environment. If you ratchet up the salt by, say, a factor of 100, we'd all die. And most other organisms would die too. They just can't tolerate that sort of huge change in things like salt concentration, or oxygen concentration, or water concentration, or lots of other basic sort of chemical factors like that. If they can't predict that the water they're living in isn't suddenly tomorrow going to be sulfuric acid, then they're in bad trouble. So predicting how your environment is going to behave is basically predicting that you'll still be alive. And a radically unpredictable environment is always lethal. So what do cells do if you put them into an environment that's an extremely challenging environment? And that's happened many times in the history of the Earth. I mean, it's going to happen again for us. But life itself has lived through some extremely radical changes, like switching to an oxygen atmosphere. If you add oxygen in the atmosphere, then things that aren't used to it burn. And lots of organisms did just that as the atmosphere became more oxygenated. Around 800 million years ago, the Earth was covered in a super ice age. They call it snowball Earth. Things were very cold. And at about that time, single-celled predators came on the scene, organisms like Paramecia. So life got really hard for lots of organisms. And so one solution to that problem of prediction, of course, is to protect yourself somehow by limiting the extent to which the environment can change. So here's a way that cells can do that. Cells can't go out and buy concrete, but they can make copies of themselves. And if a cell just makes a bunch of progeny, it can use those progeny as a shield against the environment if it does one critically important thing, and that's to turn off their ability to divide. Because otherwise they'll become competitors, and they'll want to use the original cell to protect them. But if they can't divide, you don't have that problem. So that, at least in our model, is the birth of the body. The cells in your body are not cells that could live freely. And in fact, after the evolutionary process that we've gone through, the cells that built our bodies can't live freely either. They have to live inside a body. So you can't take, for example, your gametes and put them out in the world. They'll die immediately, but they're very happy in your body. Okay, so interesting idea. We tried coding up some experiments to see if this worked very well. And here are just some experiments with a simulated environment that gets very nasty over on this end. And if you put a bunch of cells in it randomly, the only ones that survive inhabit the part of the environment that's not very bad. But if you let them build bodies, then they start to colonize this bad part of the environment. And depending on the properties of the bodies that you allow them to build, they can actually expand and colonize all of the nasty part of the environment. So building a body is useful if you're a cell and you're living in an environment that's not very nice. So what's the outcome of this way of thinking? Well, we've determined that a body helps you survive in a harsh environment. But if you look at our bodies are characterized by very particular shapes. And in fact, we all have roughly the same shape, the human shape. And all cows have the cow shape. Snakes have the snake shape, etc. There are a vast array of different shapes of bodies. And so the next question that obviously arises is, now that you've built this body, how do you get it to have a particular kind of shape that's useful to you? You know, how do you get things like hearts and livers and lungs and all that stuff to be in the right place and have the right relative sizes and all of that? That's the problem of developmental biology. And Mike Levin is a developmental biologist. And so we've been thinking about this question. And in the 80s, the first really good answer to this question became available. And here's an example. If you know very much about flies, you'll realize that something is critically wrong here. Flies are supposed to have one pair of wings, not two. This fly has two pairs of wings, and it's clearly an adult. It's actually perfectly happy with two pairs of wings. And Welcome Bidner and his colleagues made this fly by changing one gene. So if you change genes in the right way, you can radically alter what the body looks like. And the genes in this case are called Homeobox genes, and they come in big clusters, and a very critical non-randomness about evolution is that transitions between things like insects and us are accompanied and to some extent driven by making exact duplicates of entire clusters of very large numbers of genes and then letting them take on slightly different functions. So we have 4 copies of this huge set of genes that Drosophila here only has 1 copy of. But this isn't the only way you can manage bodies. Here's some work by my colleague Fallon Durant, who was able to show that only by changing the bioelectric field of a particular organism, a flatworm, the planarian, you can switch it between having one head and two heads. And the two-headed planaria, again, are perfectly happy. They grow up, they reproduce. They always reproduce two-headed progeny. They can eat, they can do everything you want. They're just a little bit confused about what direction to move in because they try to go both ways at once. So bioelectricity, not just genetics, can radically alter bodily form. And it turns out that in the planaria, the bioelectric field actually seems to tell the genes what to do because it changes first before any detectable genetic changes as these guys are growing. So this is all consistent with a view of evolution and of developmental biology that say that these operate on multiple scales simultaneously, from way below the cellular scale to way up above the organismal scale. And that unless you think about information in this extended way, it's been called the extended organism by some people, and it corresponds very nicely to the extended mind in cognitive psychology. Unless you think about organisms as extending outside of their bodies, then evolution doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so if you want to build a body and you want it to have a particular shape, you need to get information from one place to another. So here's finally, what are neurons really for? Well, our theory is that neurons are actually there to tell the body what shape to be and to allow some cells to tell other cells, okay, divide now, or stop dividing, and to build a body that looks like the right kind. And this slide has gotten a little bit screwed up in the format, but if you look at all animals, there are 5 lineages of animals that came out of the Cambrian explosion about 600 million years ago. And 2 of those lineages, the sponges and the Placozoa, have bodies that are basically amorphous. And the other 3 lineages of animals, the cyniophores and cnidarians and us, all other animals, worms, flies, fish, etc., these 3 lineages all have complicated morphology and they have nervous systems. So it suggests that nervous systems and complicated morphology go together. And in fact, what we think is going on is something like this, that neurons directly control cell growth and cell function. And neurons and other cells are constantly talking to each other in the body and negotiating what the body is going to look like, not just during embryonic development, but all of the time. So that obviously raises a question. If what neurons are doing, or a lot of what neurons are doing, of course they also have to implement thought and behavior and things like that. But if a lot of what they're doing is telling the body how to look, how to behave, perhaps the feeling of existing that we all have and that can be radically disrupted in clinical syndromes is actually our sense of our neurons telling our body what to look like. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to put this in perspective, now a larger perspective. I've showed this slide before here. If you look at life, the evolution of life, and you lay the whole thing out in space and time, then the thing you immediately see is that it's a single continuous process. And from, say, an E. coli cell to one of your cells or my cells, you can draw in time a continuous membrane that goes all the way back to our last common ancestor 4 billion years ago. And a common cytoplasm is contained in that membrane. And this picture, in fact, looks just like a picture of embryonic development. So we can think of evolution as a developmental process. And life is all one critter, all of life. So if you're feeling one with a tree, you're just seeing that this biological fact is in fact true. And we're not the only people who've recognized this. There are an increasing number of papers in the literature by biologists saying, oh, gee, all of life is actually one organism. Maybe we need to think about things a little bit differently. But this raises an interesting question. This is the last question I'll leave you with. If evolution and development are really the same thing, and we know that developmental processes are building a body, and we know that that body has a particular shape, and that developmental processes converge with incredible accuracy on one generic shape, say for humans or for cows or for oak trees or for worms, then what is the shape that evolution is trying to build? What is evolution trying to accomplish? So I'm just going to leave you with that question. What is evolution trying to do? Which I think is a very interesting question as we approach what is probably a very interesting ecological challenge for organisms like us. Most microbes, of course, won't care. And I just want to thank my colleagues, Mike Levin in his lab, and especially Joanna Bischoff and Fallon Durant, who were involved in doing this work. Thank you very much.